Fate was bullied every day until he awakened the true power of his SS rank skill. Fate is your typical disgusting loser with the job of holding a flag post in front of the castle walls. He's been there the whole day and complains about how starving he is feeling right now. He then notices a group of 4 adventurers passing nearby. One of them brags about hitting level 6 while doing their hunt a few hours ago. There was a merchant cart carrying some goods until it was attacked by a group of goblins. The goblins jumped onto the cart, but luckily, the same adventurers were close. Their leader rode a horse, ensuring the archer was protected while shooting the goblins down, and they would take care of the ones who got close to them. The long-haired dude easily deals with some monsters with his quick and smooth skills, while the huge dude did his best impression of Hulk Smash with his double-handed axe. After that, they returned to the city, where Hulk Smash brags about his level up. The group then talked about dividing the spoils of battle, but that only made Fate jealous. Despite that feeling, he knows he won't ever be able to be an adventurer. His stomach starts growling again, and he thinks he is useless. He's hungry, he has a stupid job, and his unique skill is worthless. Let's be fair, his stats are all 1, and his skill is gluttony. Despite his complaints, he knows he should be grateful to even have a job. Later that day, the city is full of life. The other group is trying to get better weapons until the announcement that the Holy Knights are coming through. The adventurers immediately hide themselves from the trio of Holy Knights. While the trio walks past, an orange rolls over to the knight's boot. The merchant apologizes for it and tries to pick it up. However, the Holy Knight kicks the merchant away. The poor man tries to apologize again, but the Holy Knights start bullying him even more. They claim the merchant is insulting them, and for that reason, they should take his head. The poor man apologizes again, but the leader of the trio tells the other 2 to stop. Before leaving, he tells the merchant to not let the same thing happen again. The trio walks away, calling the old man lucky. The group of adventurers were watching everything, but they find it hard to believe that Lady Roxy is a holy knight like them. We return to our useless Fate, who's still complaining about his hunger. Luckily, his shift is almost over, until the trio arrives. They ask if Fate did a proper job to fill in for them today. Fate lowers his head and confirms he did. The leader of the trio then drops a few coins on the floor as payment and tells Fate to pick it up. Fate complies and slowly starts picking the coins. Yet, one of the Holy Knights steps on his hand. He starts insulting Fate, saying that he is so filthy that he didn't notice him. And as you expect, Fate is a bullied person who has no way to fight back. His stomach makes noise again, making the leader of the trio mad. He claims that this noise makes it seem like they don't feed him. They ask if Fate is trying to embarrass the Vileric family and kick him away. The guy kicks Fate a few more times, and the girl joins in. She starts calling Fate's skill useless and says that he only survives because they give him money. In his mind, Fate explains that in this world, everyone's worth depends on the special powers they got from gods. They call them skills. The trio leader claims that if Fate slacks off, the result will reflect on them, his employers. The guy then orders Fate to get up, but when he tries, the other guy steps on his face and asks him to hurry up. They increase their bullying, claiming that he needs to be disciplined for failing to comply with orders. However, a voice from afar tells them to stop. This is the famous Lady Roxy Hart. She complains in her elegant way that holy knights shouldn't abuse the people they swore to protect. The trio gets annoyed just by her presence. Roxy continues explaining that watching the gate is an honorable duty for a holy knight, and that's the trio's duty to watch the stupid entrance. The leader claims it's also his duty to provide employment to useless people like Fate. She then asks why he is treating Fate like that. The guy twists her words and tells the others they will be leaving. Roxy walks toward Fate and asks if he's okay while trying to get him up. She uses her handkerchief to clean up his injuries, but Fate notices the way the trio's leader is looking at Roxy. She finishes cleaning him up and he thanks her for her help. Roxy replies that she's only doing what a holy knight should do. She then says that his shift is over and hers will begin. Fate gives her the pole, and Roxy asks him to tell her if the trio continues to do the same bullying. Fate replies that he's already used to it and leaves. Later at night, Fate is in the bar thinking about Roxy's words, but Fate knows that the trio might take revenge on her, so he decides to not involve her in this thing. The bar owner comes to him and asks if the trio did the same as usual. He tells Fate if this keeps up, he will end up like the last guy. He says the trio gives their employees endless abuse and brutal labor, but they cannot prove it because the former employees didn't live enough to tell. Fate ignores the advice and thanks for the meal. The bar dude then says he will pray so that Fate doesn't end up like that. Meanwhile, Fate walks on the streets and his stomach is making noise again. Turns out his skill allows him to be always hungry. He calls that skill stupid and wishes he could have been born with something more useful. Not something that allowed him to become a holy knight, but something that could allow him to be a warrior, merchant, or craftsman. And that's the reality of this world. If his skill is trash, he will also be considered trash. Fate then suddenly stops and notices some thieves climbing up the walls. He starts running back to alert Roxy about the situation. Upon hearing the news, Roxy gives him the pool and says she will apprehend the thieves. He wishes her good luck, and she heads inside. Fate hears blades clashing and screams until they suddenly stop. He then sees from the distance an injured thief. Fate starts to run away, but he stops after remembering that Roxy trusted him with this. He decides to confront the thief head-on and uses the spear pole to send him to the next life. Suddenly, everything around Fate starts to get dark. He hears a voice saying that his gluttony skill has been activated and that his stats are being updated. When he checks them, he sees that every single one is over 100. He also gained 2 new skills, Identify and Telepathy. He's still confused that his skill activated, and drops the pole. He doesn't understand what just happened. Roxy then comes running toward him to check if he got hurt by the thief. She notices that he doesn't look well, and she is worried. She never said that, but Fate managed to read her thoughts. He claims he isn't hurt and hears her thoughts again when she expresses relief. She then says that she will have to report the situation to her superiors. But Fate is more confused because he cannot hear her thoughts anymore. Fate tells her to take the credit all to herself because the trio would cause problems if they knew he dealt with a thief. She decides to thank him for helping her succeed in her duty and asks if he would like to work for her family. She tells him that he will meet his end if he keeps working for the trio, so he should work for her family, who would treat him fairly. Fate starts to consider the situation. Does he want to continue being treated like trash? Or does he want to have a bright future by working for Roxy? Well, he then says that if he doesn't do this job, another guy will come and suffer the same. Roxy explains the Holy Knights need to guard the entrance, not other people. In the end, he agrees to work for her. He heads back home and is still confused by his status changes. He doesn't know what his new skills are, but thinks that telepathy is what allowed him to hear Roxy's thoughts. He then starts to worry about his gluttony skill activation and what's going on with his body. But he quickly brushes it off because he can now beat monsters, probably. The next day, Fate goes to the shopping street and starts looking for a weapon. However, his budget is only 2 coins. The merchant tells him off because he won't even be able to buy a butter knife with that change. Fate came to this city 5 years ago, but he could only save up those 2 coins by working under poor conditions. The merchant then tells him that if he wants, he can have the trash weapons inside the barrel. He decides to check the blades and uses his Identify skill to check every single blade. Everything is pretty trash until he grabs the one on the back. He identifies it and thinks this blade is filthy and is being treated like trash, just like him. Suddenly, the swords start talking. Fate starts to panic but tries to not make a scene. His skill allows him to know the name of the sword, Greed. The sword then tells him that if Fate buys it, the sword will make him stronger. The sword then calls him Gluttony. Fate is confused about how the sword knows. The sword explains they have a lot in common. Fate then makes his decision and buys the sword. Meanwhile, the trio is complaining because Roxy is trying to hire Fate without asking them. The girl wants to teach Roxy a lesson, but their leader couldn't care less. After all, there are more people who need a trashy job. The girl continues to complain about Roxy, but the guy explains that Roxy's family and theirs are part of the great 5 families that support the kingdom. So, acting against her will raise some problems. The guy then says it's time for him to go to the military district. But the girl is confused. She asks why he cares so much about it. The guy then explains he wants to know about the study on how to become immortal. The girl is confused and starts laughing it off while the leader walks away. Meanwhile, Fate goes to the outskirts of the city with his new sword. The sword keeps repeating his name, just because it wants to memorize it. The sword then says that enemies come, and Fate starts to panic. A goblin jumps on him, but Fate's eyes change, and he slices the goblin in one slash. The other voice speaks again, explaining that Gluttony was activated and will increase his stats. He also gained the Strength Boost skill. Fate is confused that this happened again, but there are more goblins around. Greed starts laughing and explains that goblins always appear in groups. They all dash to attack Fate, but he manages to parry and slice them, one after one. His gluttony skill keeps activating every time he defeats a goblin. A few hours later, Fate finally manages to defeat hundreds of goblins. He now has a few more skills, but his stats are now crazy. His lowest stat is nearly 500, and his strength is triple of that. Greed then asks if Fate stopped being hungry. Fate is initially confused, but he realizes that his stomach never made noise today. Fate then asks Greed what this is all about. He thought that people could only have the skills they were born with. Greed explains it's all because of gluttony. Normally, people must fight and win battles to increase their stats or level up. However, gluttony is a cheat skill. It steals the stats and skills of whatever he defeats. The only problem is that he cannot get experience and level up. Fate asks how Greed knows about it, and the sword explains they're the same. Despite being confused, Fate notices the adventurers group coming in his direction. Greed tells him that he shouldn't let people know about his gluttony skill because it defies the divine law. Fate realizes what this means and decides that he cannot party up. He must always fight alone. Greed then tells him that he's not alone, because Greed is with him. Fate accepts those words and decides to return. Yet, Greed stops him from returning without collecting the goblin's ears. Fate is confused, but Greed explains that he will get paid if he sells them. Fate starts regretting killing so many goblins but manages to do it and get paid. He managed to earn 3 silver and 80 bronze coins and decided to get some meat for dinner. Greed stops him, telling him to do maintenance on him first. Fate still decides to get dinner first, but he bumps into a shady guy coming from a dark alley. There's a little girl with the shady guy. She touches Fate, and he hears her voice begging for his help. He sees her eyes shaking in fear, and the guy starts pulling the girl while walking away. Fate then uses his skill to identify the shady guy's skills, however it quickly disappears. Greed explains the guy has a conceal ability, which hides everything from identify. Greed asks what Fate will do, and he reveals that he will save the girl. The girl ends up in a warehouse, chained against the wall. The guy starts mocking her, telling that she will become a toy for the Holy Knights. Fate is watching closely, but Greed stops him from moving. Greed explains that Guy is stronger than him and that he should turn away. But Fate wants to help anyone he sees suffering in front of him, especially because he now has the power to do it. We then see an orphanage. The nun explains to the kids how Holy Laplace created their world. The old lady then claims that their god left their world and gave people some special powers. She asks if the young kids know the name of those powers, and they respond skills. The nun then tells the kids to thank Holy Laplace for their meal. The kids comply, and they start munching down on that depressive meal. However, one hasn't touched his food yet. The nun asks if he's feeling alright, and the boy simply says that Holy Laplace doesn't play fair. He explains that holy knights and warriors have amazing skills, but the young boy thinks he was abandoned because of his weak skill. Somehow the nun thinks the kid will be cheered up when she explains that in the old times, nobody had skills. At that time there was also no stats or even monster, it was a place where everyone was equal. The boy tears down wishing he was born in that world. The nun comforts the kid, but another one comes rushing in. She explains they couldn't find the girl who disappeared, so they will search for her in the city. The missing girl is the same one that was captured by the bad guy. The guy kicks the pole that she's chained to, telling her to cry and scream. He claims she will become a toy of the Holy Knights, but the girl still doesn't make any noise. The guy stops and starts walking away, giving the girl a chance to sob. She then hears some footsteps, but it's Fate, telling her she will be alright. He frees her from the chains and tells her to hurry up and escape. However, the other guy has returned. The guy explains he sometimes runs into guys like Fate, pathetic, useless dudes who think they're some sort of hero of justice. Fate simply smiles at the girl and pulls out Greed to fight the bad guy. The guy mocks Fate, asking if he will be able to fight while protecting the girl. He starts getting closer, and the girl ends up holding onto Fate's shirt in fear. Fate thinks he needs to get her to safety, but he doesn't know where. Greed has an idea and tells Fate to back away because the other guy thinks Fate is weaker than himself. Therefore, Greed wants Fate to take advantage of the guy's confidence. Fate follows the instructions and starts running away with the girl. The guy slowly follows them and tells he will kill Fate if he knocks the boxes down. He then tries to make Fate angry, explaining the girl will become obedient when she sees Fate's body out of soul. Fate manages to reach the endpoint, and Greed tells him it's now the time to attack. Fate then knocks the boxes where the other guy is passing by and uses them to jump and attack him. The guy manages to dodge, only taking a scratch on his cheek. The guy then starts to get serious, and his sword starts to glow. Greed knows that skill will be a problem and tells Fate to strike the guy down through his weapon. Fate uses the boxes again to leap toward the guy and manages to not only cut his sword in half but also slice the guy up. While the guy is still alive, Fate asks what he meant about bringing the girl to the Holy Knights. He questions who ordered the guy to kidnap the girl, but the guy refuses to answer. So, Fate decides to stab his wound and torture him with pain. After some seconds, the guy agrees to reveal who hired him. It was Otto Villerick, the guy who randomly used to beat Fate. Turns out the guy is a crazy dude who likes to show orphan kids some archery skills. But instead of shooting apples, he's shooting brains. Fate then takes the girl outside, telling her she will be fine from now on. His stomach starts making noise, and Greed starts to mock him. He invites her to eat something and asks for the girl's name. Sahara, she says. He takes Saraha to the street stalls and gets some meat sticks. The girl immediately starts digging in and explains this is the first time she had meat. She then suddenly starts to tear down for no reason, but Fate understands her and gives her his share. He then takes her back to the orphanage, where she reunites with the nuns. They thank Fate for helping Sahara, but he becomes confused. They ask if everything is alright, but he simply replies that nobody has ever thanked him before because he has a trash skill. The girl is confused and asks about it. Fate explains his skill simply makes him hungry. He then gets closer and tries to encourage Sahara. He tells her that no matter how hard things get, if she can laugh them off, she will end up finding happiness someday or not. Those are the same words his father told him when he was still a kid. He didn't understand them at that time, but they helped him over the years. He then walks away, and Greed explains that not only his stats increased, but he also got the one-handed sword technique. He congratulates Fate for his new skill, but Fate is confused. Greed explains this is a technical skill that allows him to get tech arts. They're literally secret techniques. In this case, he can attack twice at the same time. Fate is initially impressed, but he then realizes that if the guy managed to hit the skill, he would be sliced into 3 right now. Fate complains to Greed that he should have warned him before, but Greed simply calls Fate a hero who is trying to save a girl. Fate says he's not a hero and reveals he won't have dealt with the guy if he knew about his skill. Greed then explains that battles come down to luck of the moment, so the stronger person doesn't always win. Fate then makes up his new goal, to become strong enough and avoid winning without getting lucky. Greed then asks about tomorrow, since it will be Fate's first day working for the Hearts. Fate confirms, and Greed asks if he's going to show up looking like a pleb. This reminds Fate that he forgot to buy new clothes. Meanwhile, in a bar, there's an old man revealing the news that Sir Mason was struck down by a divine dragon in Galia. The barman asks what will happen to the Hart family, and the old man replies that Roxy will succeed him. The main problem is that Sir Mason was keeping the Holy Knights in check, if you can call it that, and the old man isn't sure she can keep them in line. The barman replies the Vilaric siblings are pretty trash, and he'd rather talk about something more pleasing. The old man then asks about Fate, and the barman replies he used to drop by every day after work. The next day, Fate arrives at the Holy Knight district, looking fresh. Upon getting close, he realizes Roxy lives in a huge mansion. He ends up meeting her by the fountain, and she smiles, explaining she was waiting for him. However, Fate doesn't reply. He's smitten by her beauty. He tells her she's pretty, and she gets shy. She then takes him inside on a tour, and her first stop is in front of a grave. Turns out this is her father, and she's introducing Fate to him. Fate is initially confused. She explains it happened 5 days ago when he met a divine dragon. Fate remembers about Galia. It's a continent dominated by monsters, and one of the Holy Knights' duties is to keep those monsters contained. She explains that it was her family's duty to contain the monsters this year. Despite being a dangerous task, it shouldn't be deadly. Still, a divine dragon that had been missing for 1,000 years suddenly appeared, and her father went to another world. Fate realizes that she's been suffering for the past couple of days, but she still looked out for him. He starts to feel sad, but she tells him not to. She's the new family leader and says they will work together to make it a joyful place. Fate accepts her words and almost shakes her hand, but he realizes that it will activate telepathy, so he points to somewhere else. Luckily, the maid chef, Haru, appears in that same place. Roxy introduces the two to each other, and she immediately starts threatening Fate, telling him to behave like a proper servant. But first, they must have lunch. Fate starts devouring some meat and acting like a guy who only ate once in his life. Haru, of course, gets annoyed because that's not how a proper servant should behave. Turns out, Fate is later tasked with trimming the bushes every day. He must keep them tidy and clean for a whole week. The other servants mention he should take some breaks and not overwork, but they also mention they always thought Fate was a weirdo because he talks to his sword. Plus, he behaves like a maniac when he eats meat. Fate only answers the meat part, explaining the last time he ate it was 5 years ago. The old servants start laughing it off until Fate's stomach starts making noise. They tell him they just had lunch and ask if he did eat. Haru then appears, explaining that Roxy wants to see him. He follows Haru but finds it weird about his stomach situation. Haru takes him to another part of the garden, where he meets Roxy. She gives him some tea and asks how he's been adapting to his job. But Fate is only thinking about his stomach. He's feeling even hungrier every second. Roxy literally shouts Faye several times until he returns to reality. That was the same name his father used to call him. He explained it to her and she asked about him. He reveals that his father died in a monster hunt. He asks her why she called him Faye, but she simply calls it a nickname for fate. And since he's been working for her, he's literally family. The guy misunderstands the whole thing, like a teenager who just saw a girl smile at him. Suddenly, he starts to feel dizzy and collapses. He wakes up in his room at night and reads a note. It's from Roxy, asking him to take a day off and rest. Fate decides to ask Greed why he's feeling hungrier, and the reason why he collapsed. Greed is surprised that Fate is only asking about that right now. He's been feeling hungrier for quite some time, but he's been able to control it until today. Greed explains that once the gluttony skill gets a taste of souls, it cannot be stopped. Fate is confused, but Greed explains the more he devours, the stronger he will get. But that will also make him want to devour more and more. By activating his skill, he will be destined to hunt and devour souls until his last day alive. Fate asks what will happen if he doesn't. Greed explains there's only two possibilities. He will either starve to death, or he will lose control and go on a rampage, putting everyone in danger. Fate is shocked because that will make him a monster. Greed then gives him some advice. When Fate's hunger approaches its limits, it will be visible in his eyes. Fate then checks his reflection in the mirror and finds out he has a Sharingan from Wish. Without any option, Fate decides to head out of the city at night to hunt. He notices that for some reason, all the warriors around smell delicious. Greed explains that is because of his hunger boost being activated. He also explains that's the reason Fate's eyes are red, and that it's a power that makes his gluttony skill more effective. With this, he will have better night vision, be able to track his prey by scent, while also terrifying and paralyzing weaker prey. Fate finally manages to find a group of goblins, and notices that his skill made them stop moving. He slices through the goblins with ease and smiles like a maniac. However, small goblins aren't enough to satisfy him. Greed tells him to head over to the hobgoblin forests. He follows those instructions and he meets some hobgoblins. He starts slicing them up, but it's never enough to free him from his hunger. After a huge hunt, he finally manages to stop feeling hungry. He doesn't want to feel like this again. Greed tells him that he must hunt monsters from time to time. Suddenly, the ground starts shaking. Fate hides and notices a huge monster carrying a human in hand. Greed explains this is a goblin king. Fate's eyes immediately change, and Greed explains they have similar stats, but the goblin has health regeneration. Greed explains it heals the wounds, enabling it to fight for a long period of time. The goblin king sits down and enjoys his human dessert. This gives Fate the opportunity to climb a tree and strike the goblin king's arm. However, Fate gets distracted to see the human dessert laying on the ground. The monster tries to smash him, but Fate manages to dodge its hits. He's clearly afraid of the attacks, but Greed tells him to trust him and rush in. Fate follows and manages to not only block the monster's attacks but also slice him down. The gluttony skill activates again, making Fate reach a whole new level. He now has several skills, and all his starts reach 5 digits. He then sits down, exhausted, and Greed says that the real deal will begin now. He explains that Fate's stats can now use Greed's first level. Fate is confused, but Greed says it's another form. Greed explains that he can get new functions if Fate offers him his stats, but that will cost every single stat point. Fate refuses, but Greed explains that if he doesn't, he won't be able to use him anymore. He then says that Fate can either be strong by himself, or he can make him Greed strong, and they work together. Fate decides to accept the deal and gives him his stats. Greed then starts transforming into a magic bow. He just needs to draw the bow and the arrow will appear. Fate decides to test it, and turns out the arrow can track the target, easily defeating a goblin that was nearby. He then decides to take the Goblin King's ears and drops them at Saraha's orphanage.